Hello and welcome to Deep Dive Movie Reviews with my friend Steve Hackman and myself, James Marsh. This episode, we are talking about Aaron Sorkin's Being the Ricardos, which chronicles a tumultuous week in the life of Lucille Ball, played by Nicole Kidman, and her husband and co-star, Desi Arnaz, played by Javier Bardem.
God, I screwed up already.
Well, I very nearly forgot Javier Bardem's name.
Yeah, I thought you paused for a second. I thought
it was a little too long before.
Is this a suspense pause or is that what's the
Javier Bardem? That's his name.
Hey, but before we start, remember this review is going to be spoiler heavy. So if you haven't seen the film already, you might want to look away for the time being. And also, if you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, ding that bell so you never, ever miss one of our reviews. James, tell us about the film.
Okay, so a lot of people will be familiar with I Love Lucy and the career of Lucille Ball. Back in the 1950s, she was the biggest star in Hollywood, really, because of this TV show that about 60 million people tuned in to watch every Monday night. Now, Aaron Sorkin, here, Oscar-winning screenwriter of The Social Network and director of Molly's Game and The Trial of Chicago 7, here chronicles 1 week in their life, in their careers, in their marriage, when Lucille Ball was being accused of being a communist. Desi Arnaz was in the tabloids for the latest in a string of salacious affairs. And what the show, and at the same time, there are sort of troubles brewing at work as well to do with Lucille's, her controlling nature and her pedantic nature about rewriting everything, wresting control away from the writers and what have you. But also she discovers that she is pregnant, and the network CBS and the sponsors Philip Morris, the cigarette company, are very opposed to the idea of this being revealed on the show. So what the film does, the film takes a very sort of unique approach. On the one hand, it kind of starts off as if it's almost a documentary with actors playing the key showrunners and producers on the show, but today, recalling what it was like, their experiences being on the show, working with Lucille and with Desi, and how their relationship played out. We also get a lot of flashbacks about how their relationship began, how they met, Lucille Ball's flirtation with being a serious actor in Hollywood, and how their sort of working relationship sprung out of their romantic relationship, and how I Love Lucy became a thing. So, Steve, where to begin with this one?
I think I want to start out, James, with you mentioned the number 60 million people would tune in every week to watch I Love Lucy. And people might not, if you're not familiar with numbers and the Nielsen ratings, that number is staggering by today's standards. I mean, you're looking at, back in the 1950s, there was 250 million Americans. Mm-hmm. You're talking nearly 1 in 4 Americans would tune in every week to watch I Love Lucy. I mean, to put that in context today, I think of like a big hit like Lost, say 15 years ago. When it launched and it had massive numbers, it was looking at like 12 to 14 million. And even in the last 15 years, those numbers have dwindled. Now a hit on TV, because things have become so stratified and there's so many different platforms and viewing options. A hit now is, help me out, but I'm going to say about 3, 4, 5 million people,
Yeah, I think that you might get as many as 10, maybe, for something that's absolutely huge, like the opening, the first episode of something, or the finale of something.
Exactly. But I wanted to throw these numbers out just to show the impact that Lucy and Desi had. And I think this film captures that, because there's so many elements of this film that Sorkin uses to show how pivotal they were in society. And even on the show themselves, the power structures, how different they were, because normally the stars have a little bit of power, but it's the producers that are the big guns. You're seeing where Desi, played by Javier Bardem, often will go over the top of the producers to get what he wants. He'd go right to the sponsors. He'd go right to the money. And I thought Sorkin did a really good job of showing how iconic that not only the show was, but how iconic these two people were. I remember when Lucille Ball died, my mom crying. And
Wow.
I grew up on Lucy to a degree, but it's not even so much my mom was like a huge Lucille Ball fan, but she was so part of the fabric of American society that when she passed, there was you felt it. And so I thought Sorkin, I wanted to start this review out by saying Sorkin, I thought, did a really good job of highlighting the just lodestone gravity that these two had during a certain time in American history. Taking it from there, I'm a huge Sorkin fan. I going all the way back to Sports Night. I love Sorkin speak. I love Sorkin walk and talks. I love the way he orders things in the universe. I've joked before, I would live in Aaron Sorkin's world. So I was all queued up to see this film. And by and large, it ticked all the boxes for me. I thought there was only a couple things that I struggled with. I wasn't thrilled that such a big name like Nicole Kidman was playing Lucille Ball, because sometimes when we cast such big stars into these iconic roles, it's hard to differentiate the star from the role that they're playing. Having said that, within about a quarter of the film, about 25% of the film, I forgot it was Nicole Kidman. She absorbed the character of Lucy. She became Lucy. We rewatched it again just recently in preparation for this review. And even Tammy said to me, she goes, this time watching it, I'm completely never even thinking that that's Nicole Kidman. That's how much Lucy is there. The other thing that I kind of struggled with is both of these characters, Desi and Lucy, were at the prime of their life. They were in their 30s, and they're played by people who are actually in their 50s. And at times, if you go back and you watch some of those old shows of I Love Lucy or Desi Arnaz interviews from the time, he is just at the prime of his life. He's not in a midlife he is young. And sometimes I'm so familiar with I Love Lucy and so familiar with Desi and Lucy growing up that at times their ages, I struggled with why they didn't cast actors that were 20 years younger. Those are just minor points, though. By and large, the dialogue was all there. The snappy, witty exchanges that Sorkin is known for. Obviously, some liberties are taken, but J.K. Simmons playing Fred Mertz. He played the perfect Fred Mertz. There's a line that he says in this film when he takes Lucy, Nicole Kidman, out to the bar to give her a little intervention talk.
Yeah.
And she goes, well, it's Wednesday morning. What kind of people are drinking at a bar on a Wednesday morning? And he just goes, it's a very eclectic group of us. It's lines like that I just made a little note of, because it's what makes Sorkin's dialogue in his films just a cut above everything else. I'll throw it back to you now. I've kind of given some intro thoughts. What do you think, James?
Okay, I'll start off by saying I wasn't as enamored by it as you were. First and foremost, I don't really hold a great sort of reverence for Lucille Ball. I grew up in England in the 70s and the 80s. I don't know even to this day that I've ever seen a full episode of I Love Lucy. There are moments that are alluded to in the film, like her crushing the grapes at the winery. I seemed that was familiar to me
because you saw it in Pretty Woman. I don't know if you remember.
Quite possibly.
It's
I saw her
watching
Pretty
Woman. Yeah.
So I didn't even see it. I saw I watched another film in which somebody else was watching it. Yeah, that's probably where I did see it. Yeah. There's another sequence I know that's very famous that isn't in the film, where she's at a conveyor belt in a factory or something,
yes, and the chocolates are going by, and she.
That's right. Yeah. Sweet Factory. But other than that, if someone had asked me before seeing this film, what's I Love Lucy about, and I couldn't tell you. And I probably couldn't have even told you the name Desi Arnaz. I would know. I knew Lucille Ball, her name, but Desi Arnaz didn't know that name. Yeah. So that's just a different. So I'm approaching it pretty much cold in that regard.
Yeah, we definitely have two completely different perspectives, because these two filled my world growing up.
Yeah, and I think that's fine. I think the film should stand on its own. If the film only works for an audience who are already in love with this material, then the film's not doing its job.
Sure.
That it's relying on its audience to do too much of the heavy lifting for itself. And there are plenty of films that do that. This isn't one of them. Similarly, I mean, Aaron Sorkin, I think he's a fantastic writer. I love Social Network. I love A Few Good Men that he wrote. I've never really watched much of The West Wing, I'll be honest, because I was never really a big TV guy. That said, I've always thought he's a better writer than he is director. And in the last couple of years, where we've seen him like in Molly's Game and the Trial of Chicago 7, I feel he still needs somebody at his side going, you can rein it in a little bit there, a bit less of that, bit more of that. This to me was mostly reminiscent in terms of his earlier work of Steve Jobs that he wrote, where it's a very theatrical experience. For me, he still feels like a playwright who has just fallen into cinema. The way that this storytelling is structured feels like theater to me. Feels like play.
It could be a play.
Like
it could be a play. Yeah.
Yeah. The use of flashbacks. You could just see sort of the light going down here and a spot coming up there, and then just doing these little sort of flashback asides, what have you. The way it has brought all of these different events and compiled them into 1 week. All these things didn't happen in 1 week. They didn't unfold like this. This is a theatrical conceit. It works, totally works. It's a microcosm of their whole experience. In which everything comes to a head, and for dramatic purposes, it works really, really well. But I was unable to completely not see that degree of artifice, and I wouldn't say it bothered me, but it just kept me at arm's length.
Right.
All of that said, I think I totally agree with you that Nicole Kidman sort of disappeared into the role. It's interesting that because I hadn't really thought about the fact that the actors were so much older than the characters that they were playing. I know that there was a lot of pushback when Nicole Kidman was announced as being cast, and I think a lot of that is to do with her age. Interestingly, she wasn't the first choice. Kate Blanchett had signed on to do it. Who isn't much younger. She's a little bit younger.
She's been around.
Also Antipodean, bizarrely. But then she dropped out for some reason a couple of years ago. So early on in the process, and I think Nicole Kidman is great. And I think I similarly I forgot I was watching her very early on, and I think for me the film works best as a kind of exploration and expose of what network television in the 1950s was like, and all the power plays, and the fact that there was this young woman who strong-headed, who didn't care whether she offended the network, didn't care whether she offended the sponsors or even her husband. It had to be her way. She knew best, and for the most part she was right as well. But it was also fascinating watching the kind of the inherent contradictions at play on a daily basis, where they wouldn't even allow her to say the word pregnant on air, yet it's sponsored by a cigarette company. Things like that. It's like, it's a very sort of conflicted sort of moral sensibility going on there, which I think is fascinating. And that's a fascinating sort of microcosm of that period of time. And I thought it felt to me that's really what Sorkin was most interested in.
Yeah.
And he just felt that, okay, yes, the story of Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz would be a perfect vehicle in order to essentially tell a story set in 1950s network TV. And I think that he realizes incredibly well.
Well, I think Sorkin is very familiar with that genre as well, because, he's done TV shows like The Newsroom, like Sports Night, like Studio 60 Live on the Sunset Strip. So yes, he's definitely fascinated with the mechanisms of what goes on behind the camera, the politics, the intrigue, the gossip, the relational spats that occur. And I think he did a wonderful job of bringing those out of the forefront. I was going to ask you, because you kind of said, it didn't really connect for you. Is there something that was missing that would have helped your connection? What do you, can you identify something that that Sorkin missed?
I don't think that it's necessarily something that Sorkin missed. I just think that it's such a specific story.
Mm-hmm.
It's about these two people that they were, her in particular was such a sort of an icon of television. She was this household name that your mother cried about when she died and what have you. And for me, she had no relevance. And I think this is kind of contradicting what I said a few minutes ago. But I think that to a degree, the film takes it as read that you kind of know who she was and how important she was, or how important her legacy would become. Because what I understand is that she went on to become even more powerful. She became like the head of a studio later on.
Desi Lucy Studios, Desi and Lucy. Star Trek.
Right.
If you see at the end of a Star Trek episode of the original series, you see Desi Lu Productions. That is Desi and Lucy. They brought you Star Trek,
which is phenomenal. But obviously, the film doesn't mention that. Not even in the final captions at the end, it just says that they got divorced, really, and that's really all that it mentions. So it does take it as read that who these people are. What the impact that they had on the entertainment industry, if not culture as a whole. And without that knowledge, it's just an interesting examination of the machinations of this particular power dynamic.
And I can certainly see that, James, because if the shoe had been on the other foot and this was a movie about a power couple in England in the 1950s of who I was vaguely aware of, I would probably approach it in a similar manner where, oh, that was nice, that was good, but it wasn't great next. Whereas for definitely Sorkin being American and the age that Sorkin is, he would have grown up not watching it live, but for people like myself in the 70s, these reruns were on all the time. I've probably seen every episode of I Love Lucy.
Wow.
At some point, multiple times. And it's just so woven into the fabric and DNA of Americans, especially over a certain age, that I would definitely say you're right. Sorkin is making a lot of assumptions of what people are bringing into their screening of his film.
Mm-hmm. And that's fine, because I think that I'm in the minority of people of certainly of his target. I'm not in his target audience to that degree. I think he's perfectly allowed to make those assumptions. He's not wrong. I mean, it's fascinating. You were listing off all of his sort of previous works, and I'd never really sort of put two and together in as much as every story he wants to tell is about sort of power plays and the mechanisms of these microcosms of power. If you go back to like A Few Good Men, it's all about how the military is full of sort of secrets and codes and obligations and honor and who has control over who else. And then obviously more overtly in things like The West Wing or The Trial of the Chicago 7 is quite literally the legal system and politics. But then even this, it's all about who has power, who has control, and those little diplomatic conversations that you have to have every day, whether it's in your marriage or with your boss or with your underlings or with your just colleagues and co-workers. Everything is a negotiation.
Yeah.
And it's a continually oscillating negotiation as well.
I agree that he loves to highlight those power plays, and I would even go a step further or take it in another direction where, and this is one of the things I've always resonated with his work for this reason, is whether it's A Few Good Men or Sports Night or The West Wing or future projects, he seems to have a desire to bring mutual respect between two conflicting bodies. Anytime, whether it's The West Wing, you got Democrats and Republicans, or it's on Sports Night or Studio 60 between the upstairs network echelons and the people at the producer level. Anytime there is dialogue which communicates, we may differ, but we're going to respect one another in some form. This is what he does so well. And there's been scenes that he has shot and scenes that he has wrote that have given me goosebumps, because, and that's where I joke, I want to live in that world. I want to live in his world. And so when J.K. Simmons takes Lucy out to explain the facts of life to her,
Yeah.
or even when Lucy goes to the producer played by Tony Hale,
who's
says,
fantastic. I love him.
Yeah, we haven't even got to Tony or Alia Shawkat yet,
Right.
our Arrested Development alumni. But when she goes to Tony Hale and she's vulnerable. That's what another thing Sorkin always does. He does a vulnerability. I will be vulnerable with someone that I trust, and then I expect that vulnerability to be reciprocated. And so there's that great scene where she just says, "I need you to save my marriage. Like I need this." Suddenly his defenses are down, and okay, then I'll do what it takes to help. And so yeah, there's definitely this thread that Sorkin does, and I think he does so well, and he does well in this film. I was going to say as well again, as well.
Yeah, and I think that's true, that he does have these particular sort of dialogue techniques, where he'll have the patter, and then he will, like you say, they'll expose vulnerability, the other will expose vulnerability, and they'll build to this great sort of punchy line of dialogue, like like this crescendo of, and I need you to save my marriage. And on the one hand, it's great drama, but it's entirely manipulative. It's not realism in any way. But I don't think he's going for realism.
No,
and
people,
that's why
people are not this witty in real life.
No, this is true. This is true. But it's, in a way, I mean, his style is a bit like Quentin Tarantino's, in as much as every character in one of his films or things talks like him. Every character kind of talks the same patter, kind of thing, just with different agendas. And it makes for great drama. But I think that there's a step away of a detachment from realism in how affected it is, and how what a construct every beat and every moment is, that I think is the thing that I fail to connect with, because I can see all the strings, if you know what I mean. I can see the how the sausage is made, and other euphemisms, I can see behind the curtain too much. And that's and that's fine in and of itself. But I think when he's as he so often does, he's trying to tell true stories. But more recently, he seems to tell a lot more sort of true stories that I feel I think you need to approach that, or most effective, if you want me to sympathize with it, you need to ground it a little bit more, add a little bit more realism in it, because at the moment it all feels a little bit too like pantomime and showy. He's so showy as a writer. He's like, look how funny I am, look how barbed my pithy comebacks are, and you're like, sure, Aaron, okay, fine. But after like 2.5 hours of every character talking like that to each other, it's a bit much.
Sure. So like you're suggesting is maybe not utilizing real life situations like Steve Jobs or Lucy and Desi, and sticking with something that's not rooted in reality, like A Few Good Men, where you can tell the full, with all the bells and whistles story you want to tell, without the need to ground it into the fact that these people really lived and had real lives, and there was some tether to reality that should be maintained.
Well, I think what I mean is that his stuff for me works best when it has been filtered through somebody else's direction. So if you got David Fincher in The Social Network, or Danny Boyle in Steve Jobs, or whomever, I think there's just that one extra pair of creative hands that his writing has to go through. There's a degree of reinterpretation. Apparently, he's very exacting about, like, no, you have to say it exactly the way it's written, with all the pauses and the punctuation, and a bit like David Mamet apparently is very much like that as well.
I listened to Rob Lowe's podcast, and Rob Lowe has said multiple times that where a lot of directors, and they'll let you kind of ad lib and play with the dialogue a little bit. Aaron Sorkin is, no, you say what I wrote, and that's it.
And I think there is a problem with that. I think it does become too singular. So it just needs a little bit more shaken, just to be shaken up a little bit more.
I certainly hear that. We said something similar, I think, in our review with the French Dispatch and Wes Anderson. What would it be like if Wes Anderson had another creative element that sometimes it gets too quirky, too narrow, and something to shake it up. Maybe not everything has to be done by Wes Anderson, and it would maybe give a more fleshed out final product.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I want to go back to Quentin Tarantino, who I think is somebody that I often associate with Aaron Sorkin in my head. Just these incredibly strong writers who occasionally can't get out of their own way when they're directing their own stuff. You look back at when Tarantino first started out, and that he had sold all these scripts that he wrote, and they ended up getting made by other people, like Tony Scott doing True Romance and Oliver Stone doing Natural Born Killers. And by all accounts, Tarantino doesn't like the finished products of those movies, but I think they're perfectly good movies in their own right. And arguably, it's the changes that were made that have actually helped the final project. And it's a shame that since then, particularly now, where Tarantino seems to not really know what he wants to do with himself, career-wise, it's a shame that he won't let anybody direct his scripts anymore.
Right.
Because I think it's arguably it's the best thing that could happen to him right now. If he just sells a few scripts, lets go, and has a chance for other people to sort of reinterpret his work. It'd be fascinating to see if anybody does remake any of his films.
That would be interesting. Forward. Yeah, it would be interesting.
He would probably have to be dead first before he would allow it, but it would be kind of interesting. And I think Sorkin's the same way. He's finding his feet as a director.
Yeah.
And I think this is probably, for me, I think it's probably the best directed film, or the least badly directed film of his stuff, because I still don't think he's particularly great as a director. He's too self-serving, but he's getting there.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think he needs a little more editing, a little more. There's some trimming of the fat that needs to come off the movies that he directs, for sure. But we've kind of critiqued Sorkin. We've talked about Nicole Kidman's portrayal of Lucy. What about the rest of the cast? How did they measure up for you?
By and large, pretty strongly. It's I'm surprised that J.K. Simmons has an Oscar nomination. We're recording this about 2 weeks away from the Oscars, and Nicole Kidman, Javier Bardem, and J.K. Simmons have all been Oscar nominated. I think J.K. Simmons is great, and he's one of these guys who will show up and always deliver. But it doesn't strike me as an awards-worthy performance. But as we've mentioned, Tony Hale, I thought was fabulous. He's great at being sort of weak. Weak and vulnerable, but desperate to be taken seriously and to be respected. I think he does that incredibly well.
It's Buster from Arrested Development.
It is. I wanted to stop short of saying that he kind of has to do the same thing all the time, but he's very good at this kind of role. And then, I mean, it's such a robust ensemble. I mean, all the suits. They don't really get a lot of screen time, but you're like, oh look, there's Clark Gregg, and oh look, there's what's his name from Mad Men, and they come in and they do their stuff. It was nice seeing old Ronnie Cox, who I always love from sort of Beverly Hills Cop and RoboCop and
Deliverance.
Deliverance, of course, going back a bit further. Who's playing, the older version of one of the executives, sort of in the documentary sort of interview flashbacky, reminiscent kind of part of it, which was interesting. So yeah, I mean, what did you think? Because I thought it was a pretty faultless ensemble, actually.
No, absolutely, and I concur. I wouldn't necessarily have given J.K. Simmons the nomination, not because I don't think he did a fantastic job of portraying Fred Mertz. It's just, or William Frawley, the actual person. It's so much that he, like you said, he delivers that stand-up performance every time. And I didn't see where this one was noticeably needed to be highlighted as opposed to some other great performances that he's done. But that's a personal preference. I love the moment where Tony Hale's in the room with Alia Shawkat, because they're both from Arrested Development. And I had this flashback moment because if you ever watched Arrested Development, Alia Shawkat played Maybe, and there's a
Mm.
whole storyline where she is faking being a movie executive who has to make all these movie decisions. And I just thought it was funny watching Tony Hale there and her basically playing her Maybe character, but she's making the decisions for real. It's not really a review. I just got a little bit of a chuckle out of that moment. I thought Nina Arianda bouncing off and playing off of J.K. Simmons worked really well. The chemistry was there. You probably wouldn't be familiar with it, but I'm very familiar with, they had a tumultuous off-screen relationship.
Okay. No.
If I'm correct, when he died, she didn't go to the funeral, and she made some kind of comment. I forget the comment off the top of my head.
Wow.
But this is how much they didn't get along. And the root, if I understand, the root of it was that she was 20 years younger than him. And she didn't like being, she wanted to see herself, as Aaron Sorkin kind of identifies in the film, slimmer, younger, prettier, more attractive. Why are you casting me with this old man? And so that was the root of that kind of relationship. And I thought Sorkin did a good job, and the chemistry between the two actors really demonstrated that, you know, these two people have to play a married, loving couple on screen. And a minute that camera, as soon as they call cut, they go off to their separate dressing rooms, and there is limited interaction between them.
I always find that fascinating. I mean, you read about these all over the place, but yeah, no, I think, yeah, if that's the case, then he's certainly softened it. He articulates it. You know, he gives Vivian a nice little speech, you know, where they discover that she's might have an eating disorder or maybe not. And, you know, she's been dodging her meals at least.
Yes.
And yeah, Lucille sort of confronts her about that. And I think, yeah, it's addressed. So therefore, but I don't think you get the suggestion that off-screen relationship is as vicious as you're saying.
Which again, it's again Sorkin requiring us to do the heavy lifting. You've got to be in the know, and then it makes a lot of sense. Whereas for someone coming from it a little with less knowledge, you want it spelled out a little plainer. Well, what's the root of this? But Sorkin kind of makes that you kind of know what it is.
Yeah, because I mean, not knowing any of that, you come out of it thinking, well, William Frawley's just a bit cantankerous, and he's just not very nice to work with. They talk about the fact that he drinks all day long at set. Yeah, he makes it. There's a great line where Lucille asks him, she goes, "Don't you and Desi have an agreement that you don't drink on set?" He's like, "Desi and I have agreement that I won't be drunk on set." And I was like, okay, that's I like that kind of distinction.
Well, again, it's the 1950s too. It's the Mad Men. There's just different social mores at play.
Absolutely. Oh yeah, the notion of you're not allowed to drink at work or smoke at work would be outrageous. Infringe on his civil liberties.
Oh, they'd be smoking everywhere. I still remember old interviews with Desi where he would just be in an interview just puffing away.
Philip Morris was the sponsor of the show. You know, that puts a timestamp on it immediately. The fact that a cigarette company was allowed, not that it was, but that it was allowed to be the sponsor of anything. Yeah, it's kind of pretty crazy.
Yeah.
And I think, a lot of the script, I for the most part did enjoy like the detailed and the minutiae of the office politics. But at the same time, you do get the impression that Sorkin has like made a list of 50s tropes and that are no longer okay in society, and he's just working through them, trying to tick off as many as he can, like Alia Shawkat's character being like the only girl in the writer's room, which was an achievement unto and of itself. But she's arguably the best writer in the writing room as well, and her constant sort of dueling with Jake Lacy's character as to who wrote which joke and who wrote it the fastest and who wrote it first and all that. And so there are moments where like she's talking with Lucille and they're sort of trying to exert authority upon one another, but at the same time trying to reassure each other and recognize their respect for one another as women and the rest of it. And you just felt that Sorkin was literally he was just ticking boxes a little bit.
Yeah.
It was a little bit cluttered in there at times.
Yeah, I'm the first to say I don't like when social mores of today kind of backpedal into the 1950s, I'm not so sure that women would even be having too many of those conversations in that way. It's almost like a wink to this 21st century audience who's watching this film. And sometimes I agree with you. It's that check. Okay, we've ticked that box. We've done the shout out, our obligatory shout out in this. Yes, it's unrealistic. It wouldn't have ever happened, but this is for our 21st century people who are watching this. This is
sure. And I think it comes from theater as well, because theater is less subtle than cinema.
It's true.
You know,
yes.
Everything is a far bigger gesture, a far broader stroke, if you like. Whereas in cinema, you can be far more subtle. You can say a lot more with a look and a wink and a nod, which you can't see quite literally on stage. And so I think this is just another example of Sorkin in his period of adjustment.
That's why I didn't do well when I auditioned for the Nicole Kidman show, The Expatriates. That was the expats that was here.
Yes.
Did I tell you I auditioned for that?
I don't remember.
In September. And, I've done a lot of stage acting. And I realized I really needed to practice more.
You were all jazz hands.
I was all jazz hands. And they're like, you don't have to. And I'm like, I'm playing to the back,
Yeah. To the cheap seats. Yeah.
Suffice to say, you're not going to be seeing me on the new Nicole Kidman TV show, The Expats.
For sure.
Next time. Anything we need to say before we wrap this up? Javier Bardem. We didn't really talk about Javier's performance.
No, that's true. We didn't. I mean, I don't know
if there's much I would have to say. Yeah.
No, I mean, yeah, he's like J.K. Simmons. He shows up and he delivers, and it's great. And it's a fascinating dynamic, because obviously the narrative, the plot is all about Lucille being accused of being a communist, and he's the one who's fled communism. He got run out of Cuba. His dad was a mayor or something, got arrested, and he's the one who came away. So that the very notion that he would then shack up with a communist after coming to America is outrageous to him. But then he offends her by saying publicly, oh, she ticked the wrong box, and I thought that was kind of really interesting that she was pretty adamant. I didn't tick the wrong box. I was just sort of ill-educated of the consequences of ticking that box when I did it. I did it out of solidarity for my grandfather, who was like in the working man's party or whatever, and just wanted the best for everybody. And I did it for granddad,
who knew 20 years ago there was going to be a Red Scare,
Well, exactly. In the 1930s. Yeah, exactly. Who was to say? So I think that was kind of fascinating dynamic, how that was dealt with. But he's just one of these sort of great seasoned thesps who brings a lot of screen presence and is perfect in the part, even though, like you say, he is about 20 years too old.
Yeah, he had the singing numbers down too. I didn't realize he'd be able to pull off the Desi, the Babalu. I mean, that's another thing that Desi Arnaz was so known for playing Ricky Ricardo, the Babalu. I grew up and everything was Babalu, Babalu. But if you're not American, you're probably not familiar with that. And so again, I thought Javier, despite the age, he pulled off Desi pretty well.
Excellent. Yeah, I mean, like I said, I couldn't have told you the name Desi Arnaz, I don't think, before watching this. But now it's kind of, I thought about he sold it completely. He was fascinating in the part.
So James, what do we want to score this out of?
I was thinking about accidentally ticked boxes.
how many accidentally ticked communist boxes should we score this?
That works. You go first. Okay. You always like to go first.
That's right. And I think I'm going to score this a little higher than you. I was trying to decide whether I consider this a 4 or 4.5. And I'm going to go with 4.5 because I love you know what? I'm going to take that back. Tammy distracted me. I meant to say 4. I meant to say 4. I didn't know what I was saying. Tammy says I'm shaking too much. And she was trying to give me, shaking my leg and shaking my whole body. Okay. James, I'm going to give this a 4. I thought it was a solid Sorkin endeavor. I certainly hear some of the critiques you have in the film, and I would agree with most of them. But like we've said, I bring a lot more foreknowledge and appreciation from the heart for the source material of this film. So I'm already going to be a little biased. I think even if somebody's not familiar with Desi and Lucy, they're still going to enjoy this film. I can highly recommend it. But if you grew up and you love this couple and you know about I Love Lucy and their story resonates, I think Aaron Sorkin's film chronicling this little slice of their life is something to go see. So I'm giving it 4 accidentally ticked communist boxes.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I didn't like it that much. It's one of those films where you seem to get a couple of films like this every award season, where there's a widely lauded performance in an otherwise slightly chunky, kind of wonky film. I think this year
Jessica Chastain, and
I was about to say this year, I think being the Ricardos, and I think the Eyes of Tammy Faye are similar. Bohemian Rhapsody is another. I think The Iron Lady, Darkest Hour. It's quite often a biopic under heavy makeup.
Yes, yeah,
and they always seem to win awards for it. And you watch it and you're like, the performance is big and over the top and showy and all the rest of it, and the film is just not very good. It's just a bit wonky. So I think that this is one of those films, but I think that as we've been discussing it, I think that there are plenty of elements in it that I did enjoy, and I think that the cast are all great, and I think I really did sort of enjoy just watching them, and I did really enjoy the sort of behind the curtain look at 50s sort of network television, which is something that I only sort of tenuously am aware of. Only through other TV shows and other films do I have a sort of a profound understanding of that. And it's kind of, despite all of my issues with Sorkin, particularly Sorkin the director, I think I think it was a kind of interesting introduction. But I did come away going, I really need to read a lot more about who these people were, and I'm not sure that that's always the best. The best way to come out of a film going, I feel like I don't know anything about this. Yeah. I should come out of a movie going, oh, I now feel like I know something about this. That said, I think on its own merits, it's fairly entertaining. So I think I'm going to give it 3. I think I had in my notes chalked it down as like 2.5, but I think that's a little bit harsh. Having discussed it with you, I think its merits, despite its flaws, are worth a little bit more than that, a little bit more respect than that. So I'm going to give it 3 accidentally ticked communist boxes out of 5.
Well done. I'm interested to see over these reviews how sometimes I've reviewed a little bit differently. I gave a final score a little bit differently after processing it with you a little bit. I think, okay. Well,
I think it certainly helps. It certainly helps to sort of articulate your feelings about it sometimes, rather than just sitting at home on your own going, well, I thought that was terrible, or I thought that was great, And likewise, hearing your views on films as well is broadens our. Well, that's why we exactly.
That's why we do it. We're not in it for the money.
Not yet.
Hey, that's going to wrap up this episode of Deep Dive Movie Reviews. Join us in the conversation. Give us a comment in the boxes below, as well as there's some information, some links if you want to follow James and I on social media, on Instagram and Twitter. You'll find us there. James?
That's right. Please do subscribe to our channel, ding the bell so you never miss a new episode. Leave us a comment. Let us know what you would like to hear us review in the future. And please check out our other videos. We're getting close to 30 videos now, and we've covered quite a lot of, particularly of this season's awards nominees. So do check those out as well. And that's it. Until next time, thank you very much. Goodbye.
See you next episode. Bye-bye.